My name is Steve Tamari. Welcome to the Quaker Palestine Israel Network and AFSC webinar on boycott, divestment, sanctions for friends, schools, administrators, teachers, and staff. I'm the clerk of the Quaker Palestine Israel Network. We at the Quaker Palestine Israel Network have been thinking for a while that even though Quakers have a long history of engaging in nonviolent social justice movements and in supporting movements that use boycotts as a tool or a strategy for economic activism, that there's a lot of misinformation or maybe too little information about the meaning and significance of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in the struggle against the Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights. So that's why we thought this webinar would be useful for folks connected in some way with Quaker and Friends schools. I wanted to say just a few words about QPIN, and since the time is so short, I think I'll just read this this is basically from our mission statement. The Quaker Palestine Israel Network, QPIN, is a volunteer organization established in 2013 to increase Quaker participation in efforts to build a lasting, just peace in Palestine and Israel. QPIN aims to facilitate the sharing of ideas, energy, and experiences among friends as they seek to educate their meetings and churches about Palestine and Israel, and to encourage support for boycott and divestment campaigns and other nonviolent strategies to advance an agenda of justice for Palestinians and Israelis. That's basically the purpose of QPIN, and if you're interested at some point in learning about upcoming webinars or getting involved in our work, you can always email me, and my email information is there, I think, for you to use if that helps. You can also check out our website, and I think the link is there, or the information is there under the QPIN little logo. I wanted to thank many of us on the panel here, and Diana and Lucy from the AFSC, because the AFSC has done a lot to support our work and this webinar in particular. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I just wanted to quickly outline what the basics of boycott, divestment, sanctions, also known as BDS. And can I move this slide? So here's the basics from the BDS movement. You can check out the website if you want more information about this. But basically, BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, is the result of a 2005 call by Palestinian civil society on international organizations and individuals to place nonviolent economic pressure on Israel for its abuse of Palestinian human rights. Specifically, the call asks internationals to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel and Israeli and international companies involved in the violation of Palestinian human rights, as well as Israeli sporting, cultural, and academic institutions that are also complicit in violations of Palestinian human rights. The boycott call is based on three essential goals, ultimate goals. One is an end to the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Syrian Golan Heights, and the dismantling of the apartheid wall. Two is equality for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. And three is to protect the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties. So that's a short summary of the basic meaning and significance of BDS. To explore that more deeply, we have two speakers. Our first speaker is Lauren Brownlee, who is a member of Bethesda Friends Meeting and also serves on the Peace and Social Concerns Committee and the Growing Diverse Leadership Committee of Baltimore Yearly Meeting. She's also the Baltimore Yearly Meeting appointee to Sandy Spring Friends School Board of Trustees. She's an alumna of Sidwell Friends School and worked at Sidwell for 7 years as Assistant Director of Auxiliary Programs and as a history teacher, during which she served as Clerk of the Upper School Quaker Life Committee. She has completed the Friends Council on Education's Institute on Engaging Leadership in Friends Schools and had an article recognizing the teacher activism published in the Friends Council book, Leading in the Light, Celebrating 325 Years of Quaker Education. She is a member of the Friends Journal Book Review Team, the DC team, and the steering committee of the Quaker Palestine Israel Network. That is our group. She is currently the Director of Social Action at Stone Ridge School of the Sacred Heart in Bethesda, Maryland. So I will turn it over now to Lauren, and then I will introduce our second speaker.
Be sure to unmute yourself, Lauren.
I'm working on it. Okay, I should be unmuted now.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so as Steve said, I am an alumna of Sidwell Friends School. I was a lifer at Sidwell, which at Sidwell means I started in kindergarten and was there for 13 years. And when I graduated, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew that it was important to me based on what I had learned at the school about Quaker values and letting my life speak, that I wanted to leave the world a better place than I found it. And I even started calling myself a Quaker when I graduated, even though I didn't actually start regularly attending meeting for another 6 years after I graduated. But the Quaker identity became really important to me during my time as a student. And then I came back right after I graduated from college and started working at the school. And in my very first year of teaching, I went around all the time talking about how I was a Quaker and would say things to students like, I don't believe in hate. And they would say, oh, you must hate someone. And I would say, no, I don't. I'm a Quaker. And I developed this group of students in my first year history class who just wanted to connect everything we were learning in world history that year to Palestine. One of them was half Palestinian, and every issue in world history as it would come up, he would say, well, do you know how this connects to Palestine? And I had not really known anything at all about Palestine before that. And through these conversations with him, I really dove in, particularly because he and his good friend who would also bring it up were very angry. And they would talk about how hate was the only answer, that they could only see violence as a response to what was happening to Palestine, that there was no other way. And I had just been to South Africa with the Black Student Union from the school earlier that year. And I kept trying to give them this example of, in South Africa, people had this other way and they, were able to use all these other tactics. And they just kept saying to me, no, you're wrong. You don't understand. That's not like that in Palestine. And so ultimately, I went to graduate school to prove them wrong, that they, as they kept saying that there couldn't possibly be any other answers, I went to Georgetown and got my degree in global, international, and comparative history with a focus on conflict and conflict resolution in the Middle East and Africa, and wrote my thesis there on nonviolent activism in the in Israel and Palestine, and specifically how both Palestinians had used nonviolent activism, how Israelis had used nonviolent activism for justice, and how the international community had supported them as well, in addition to cross collaboration between Israelis and Palestinians. And so during that 2-year program, I would continue to meet with those students who had sparked my interest in this and report back to them on what I was learning about how nonviolence intersected with Israel-Palestine. And I'm not entirely sure that I totally won them over on any specific tactics that I was trying to use, but I think that they did develop a real respect for the fact that I cared so deeply about finding what those answers were. So I think, to me, I'm going to move my slide one more. This is not those students, because those were boys, but just an example of how often it is students who are leading us in this work about peace and justice, and who really inspire me in the way that I approach these topics and what I think is important to talk about. So this is Sandy Spring, where, as Steve said, I am on the board, and where last year I gave a talk on how passivism isn't passive. Because I think for Quakers, as we talk about the peace testimony, I think there's often a misunderstanding that the peace testimony means being neutral, means not taking sides. And I think that often we can say, well, I'm taking the side of peace and justice, and that doesn't always look the same way. And I think that that's really important for people to realize that that doesn't mean being neutral. It means being active and taking action for justice. And the thing that speaks to me is that justice work is almost never free of conflict. And I know, as Steve has said, BDS can feel like there's a lot of controversy surrounding it, but I think that's something that we have to remember as we engage in this justice work, is that anything that you do that is really acting for a justice cause, there are going to be people who are opposed to it, because at the end of the day, when we are trying to make things equitable, there are people who are going to lose power in that to make it so that everyone has that equal access to opportunities. So I love this Howard Zinn quote of, "You can't stay neutral on a moving train." And then also this Desmond Tutu quote that, "If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." And then, oh, I think I missed, that Ta-Nehisi Coates, along the same lines, said that anti-racism is always divisive. And I think that that, as I said, is true for a lot of justice work, that it's not just anti-racism work that's divisive. But as we do these topics, I think it can be hard, especially for Quakers who want to avoid conflict, to feel that they are doing the right thing when they are engaging in work that is filled with conflict. But I think when we are doing anti-racism, when we are doing justice work, we have to be confident that we are doing the right thing, even if we hear back from it, as long as we are grounded, as long as we remain grounded in what our Quaker values are. And in Quaker schools, we've got beautiful mission statements that reflect to those values. We've got clear statements about the testimonies, the spaces that we can ground ourselves in when we talk about why it is that we do what we do. And I wanted to point to the fact that, additionally, when we think about who the heroes that we have for peace are, when we think about the models that we give to students, I am a history teacher, so I'm often giving students models for peace work, and that they too were engaging in issues that were not universally accepted. And I think that has been coming out a little bit more this year, as particularly in the United States, we've all been engaged a little bit more in justice work, I think, than societally we were even a year ago. And to then take that to one more important historical figure, Frederick Douglass, who said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. The struggle may be a moral one or it may be a physical one, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will." And it just reminds me that when we engage in activism, when we engage in work that is doing the hard actions, the hard work, that so often it is successful. And we look back on that historically in really positive terms, but we don't get there immediately. So that is the context in which I have done the activism that I have done over the years. And for me, I've engaged in the Quaker Palestine Israel network and the work of Quakers in the Middle East, particularly because that is what my students sparked in me. And I think it's really important as we think about that and engage in that to understand that we are as forcefully against anti-Semitism as we are for Palestinian justice. It's not an either or for us. We work really hard on both of those things, and we understand that that is what it takes to be authentic to our Quaker values and to the school's Quaker values. And I wanted to add, as I say that the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions National Committee website includes a statement that BDS is an inclusive, anti-racist human rights movement that is opposed on principle to all forms of discrimination, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So that is something that we are not alone in saying, but that the BDS movement itself has a strong take about. And so I just wanted to close with a quotation from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which has really been inspirational to me in the last few months as we think about the activism that is, again, sparking up right now in a moment that I think is really powerful, both for Quakers, for engaged citizens, for students. I know as I work with students that they are really fired up right now. So the quote that came to me was, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue so that it can no longer be ignored. By citing the creation of tension as part of the work of nonviolence may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension, which is necessary for growth." So that, to me, is what is at the heart of the BDS movement, and Dalit is going to go much more deeply into the BDS movement. But from my perspective, some facts that are important, and we're going to later reference a document that QPIN, the Quaker Palestine Israel Network, helped to put together called Engaging Critics of Bds, that talks about how BDS uses nonviolent means to challenge the violence and oppressive policies that they are up against, that it never engages in or threatens violence to anyone, that it calls for accountability and changes in the behavior of institutions and companies, that it's not about punishing people, but ending abusive behavior and ensuring accountability, that it is not interested in harming individuals, and that boycott and divestment are proven nonviolent tactics used in many situations. So to me, it all comes back to a quote from Khalil Gibran, that work is love made visible, and that Quaker schools should teach students that justice work is Quaker values made visible. And I think we should do that proudly, and proudly teach our students to be advocates for justice and for those issues which they care about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Am I on now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to introduce our second speaker, Dalit Baum, PhD. She's the founder of Who Profits from the Occupation and the Coalition of Women for Peace in Israel. Dalit is a feminist scholar and teacher who has been teaching about militarism and about the global economy from a feminist perspective in Israeli and American universities. She has been active with various groups in the Israeli anti-occupation and democracy movement, including Black Laundry, Boycott from Within, Zochrot, Anarchists Against the Wall, and Women in Black. Dalit has headed the Economic Activism for Palestine program of Global Exchange. She has worked for the AFSC in the San Francisco office since 2013, and she currently serves the organization as Director of Economic Activism. And I will hand it over to Dalit now.
Thank you so much, Steve. Hi. I'm excited to be with you today, actually, which is interesting because it feels like I've been talking about this topic so long, but still, this is exciting. Quaker educators who teach about nonviolence every day. Now we're talking about nonviolence. This is a slide, if you can see it, I think most of you are on the web, from a huge march I've participated in 2001 as part of the Coalition of Women for Peace and Women in Black. As you can see, it's Women in Black. 5,000 women marching against the occupation in Jerusalem. I've been involved in the Israeli peace movement or the women's peace movement in Israel for since the 90s, and tried to mainly reach out and educate other Israelis about what I've found out to my great shock in my late 20s, that I live in a country where almost half the population has no civil rights. I thought that I lived in a democracy, but I didn't know. So I thought that many Israelis, just like me, would rather not see it for some reason, mainly racism and all sorts of other reasons that I think Americans are very well familiar with. And our goal was to try and get them to see it so we can change it, so we can actually have a true democracy, a true equality, a true sharing of the land among everybody that lives on it or has lived on it. In 2003, one really big, moment in my growth as an activist was when the Palestinian grassroots movement that was organizing to stop the construction of a wall, of a separation wall in Palestine by the Israelis, has invited Israeli activists to join their nonviolent movement. And this was my first introduction, actually, to Gandhian traditional nonviolence. People just going out there with their bare hands in front of the armed soldiers who shoot them, and do it again and again and again and again and again. This was on one level a not very successful movement because, as you know, the separation wall or the apartheid wall is built, almost fully built. It will never end, I think, on the West Bank. On the other hand, it has been a tremendously successful movement in shifting consciousness, with thousands and thousands of activists that came from all around the world to participate in these demonstrations, and also, I think, among Israelis. This is just one image from these demonstrations. We have learned a lot. I think things that I didn't know as an activist within Israel. One thing that I've learned is that this is a Palestinian movement. It is a Palestinian liberation movement, and me, being white and very, very privileged in that setting, cannot use that privilege in order to take over and dictate the terms of that movement, tell Palestinians what they should aspire to. I've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of Palestinian activists being injured and imprisoned, jailed, just for participating in a demonstration, in a non-violent demonstration. There are a few dozens who were also killed by the military in such settings. The courage, the persistence, the humanity, this is how non-violence works. Yes, it transforms anyone who sees it. One of our members in my group, or the Israeli groups that joined some of these demonstrations, was an ex-soldier who came to one of these demonstrations as a soldier, and then the moment he was released from a compulsory military duty, he joined the demonstrations because he knew this is where he should be. So what is our role as Israelis? What is our role as Americans? It's not that different. We have people there putting their lives on the line for the most basic of rights. So their property will not be taken away from them arbitrarily by a foreign army. So they'll have some political rights of determining their own future and controlling their own community, and are facing tremendous violence. What is our role? Especially since, as an Israeli, this is my country who is conducting most of this violence. And I think as Americans, you know that it is your country that is financing it and supporting it and providing the legal and political impunity for it. So what is our role? As this is a Palestinian movement, we should ask the Palestinians. And the Palestinians actually have given us an answer. So in 2005, this was the anniversary of the ruling of the International Court of Justice about the wall on the West Bank being illegal by international law. So at the 1 year anniversary, we have the call from Palestinian civil society, which includes about 170 different groups, women's groups and student groups and Islamic groups, religious groups and communist groups, groups that usually don't have anything in common, that came to one call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel until it complies with international standards of human rights and international law. When I first came to this country, which was about 6 years ago, I think, I gave many talks about the call and about BDS, and people were debating whether or not to endorse the call. And I kept telling them, you don't need to endorse the call. Palestinians never asked you to join their call. They are already making the call. The call is already out there. This is a call for action. So your only decision is how do you respond to the call for action. And the call for action is actually not very precise. We are not told what to boycott or what to divest from. We are asked to use the traditional tools of Gandhian non-cooperation in order to step away from that same actions of violence and discrimination and colonization and theft, pillage, that we do not agree with. Now, this is something that Quakers have actually told us and taught us over the years how to do. So I'll tell you about some of these campaigns. The first thing I've participated in was a project called Who Profits from the Occupation, which has recently grown to be an independent research center, and in fact, the most prominent research center about occupation profiteers. And the idea was that we as Israelis, Jewish and Palestinian Israelis alike, we have the privilege of movement and language. We can go around, we can find out more about who the profiteers are. And these are the ones that need to divest from the occupation. In other words, we are asking the companies to divest from the occupation. And we are asking them in all sorts of ways. But the first thing to do is to know who they are. So if you want to see, you can go to whoprofits.org online and see a database of about 600 companies that have meticulously been collected on the ground by activists who have collected this information that was not available before because nobody cared for this information. And then you have a network of campaigns all around the world ever since then that responds to the Palestinian call with different groups doing different things. They don't have some shared political vision. You know, if you ask them, do they believe in 1 state, 2 states, 5 states, no states? Some will and some won't. What they do have in common is this commitment to non-cooperation with evil and their commitment to put their bodies on the line if needed. So some will only boycott settlement goods. Some, in this picture, you will see demonstrations against Lockheed Martin and Boeing, the big weapons companies, because they supply the big platforms of killing to the Israeli military. that are used against civilians. And this is during one of the attacks on Gaza, on civilians in Gaza. Maybe some of you have heard we had a national campaign targeting a small soda company, SodaStream, which gained a lot of publicity thanks to Scarlett Johansson in the picture, who was their presenter. It was fun, and it was also very successful. The company has left the illegal settlement where they had their main manufacturing site. These are demonstrations or in outside the headquarters of HP, Hewlett-Packard, a company that has been involved in Israeli military affairs for over a decade, especially with equipment for checkpoints, military checkpoints and IDs. The company has recently stepped away from that business, so we count that as a success as well. So you see, the idea of these targeted, the campaigns targeting companies is not so much to promote hatred against HP. You know, we don't necessarily think that companies are bad or evil or good. You know, they are not people. But companies care about profits. And so if we can influence their bottom line, they will change their policy. As long as the occupation is extremely profitable, they will get into it, try to profit from it, and by doing so will also help maintain it and sustain it politically and economically. So the idea is if we get these big multinational corporations to step away from this behavior, we take away one of the pillars of support for the occupation, and at the same time, we make these companies better. We really think that the idea is to make these companies better. We don't want these companies involved in such harmful behavior. Another huge campaign, maybe the first BDS campaign ever, and the one that lasted the longest, were the campaigns targeting a French multinational called Veolia. This was a campaign that was truly global. We had municipalities in England that have passed resolutions to not do business with these companies that usually used to provide public transportation, waste management services to municipalities. All of that because this company has provided the same services in settlements, including dumping Israeli waste on Palestinian occupied land, which is very cheap because you don't have to pay anyone. You know, the land is stolen, so ownership doesn't count. Or providing transportation services by light rail and buses to the settlements on privately owned Palestinian land that was confiscated from its rightful owners. So this was an actually very educational campaign. There was one big success in St. Louis. We have Steve here, so I want to mention that got Veolia out of St. Louis. We had a big a conference we've organized in the Bay Area, bringing together environmental groups and labor groups that had a beef with the same company and educating each other about our issues. The beauty of that campaign was that people around the world in different local communities could have a shared target. Not a target to hate, as I said, but a target to educate around. Suddenly, something that used to be thought of as a foreign affairs issue, what's happening with transportation to settlements, it sounds very, very distant. This all became a local issue. It became a local issue for our own municipality, for our own region, for our own city, because this is the city that runs, for example, the Sonoma County buses were run by the same company. So we had a hearing with the Human Rights Commission in Sonoma County about Veolia and how some people in the community didn't want the same companies that runs segregated buses in Palestine, segregated buses, because Palestinians cannot use those buses, although they were on their land. They didn't want those segregated buses company in their own county. So in a way, these campaigns became a very powerful tool for educating people, for learning more about Palestine, for breaking a silence that was imposed for a very, very long time on anything to do with Israel-Palestine. And it was very successful. You see here an image of one of the student debates, and some of the logos of the student groups, Students for Justice in Palestine across the country, that have passed dozens of resolutions in school after school after school, asking their school to divest not from Israel. This is propaganda. You have to read the resolutions. Resolution after resolution after resolution, asking their school to divest from companies that are involved in grave violations of human rights and international law in a consistent way, knowingly, over time. It's better phrased in those resolutions. You should read them. But it's always the same. And don't we want that for all places around the world? Don't we want to say that we shouldn't invest public funds of a school or any public institution in companies that are knowingly and consistently involved in war and occupation and grave violations of human rights? These were the resolutions. But the resolutions themselves have no power because students don't get to determine where the school invests. The power was in the debate. And if you can see this picture, that's the victory of those campaigns. Getting students to gather up and sit all night at sometimes, again, a week after week after week, and listen to all views, and have students who disagree with this also debate their views and go to the library or go online and do more and more research to find more details about these companies such as Veolia, such as Hewlett-Packard, such as Caterpillar, trying to learn more about what these companies are actually doing and debating those details. This is a huge learning moment. And whatever the vote was in the end, these students are going home knowing a lot more about the world they live in, the economy they live in, and what is justice. Just another example, G4S, I don't know if you heard about it, one of the largest companies on earth. In fact, it's the third largest private employer in the world. It's a security company, also one of the big targets, involved in operating prisons all around the world, involved in providing all sorts of systems to Israeli prisons and Israeli checkpoints. I'm just giving it as an example so you'll see how people could also make connections between different movements and learn more about what's going on. This is one of my favorite pictures in the history of the BDS movement. This is a moment of the vote at the Presbyterian General Conference a couple of years ago, when the Presbyterian Church has voted to divest from 3 companies, HP, Motorola, and Caterpillar. Again, the news were all about divestment from Israel. This was not divestment from Israel. None of it really is. This is about divestment from companies that the church has engaged with for over a decade about their specific human rights violations as part of the Israeli occupation. And these were the companies that did not respond well to that engagement process. So the church actually had no choice but to sell the investment in them. But still, it was a very, very close call. I think they're 2 votes apart, that vote, and a huge victory in mainstreaming and normalizing and sending the message that it's okay to talk about Palestine, that Palestinian rights are human rights too, and they should be counted when you are screening your investment for human rights. I'll jump ahead. I'll just show you this beautiful slide because it shows all sorts of companies that have divested from the occupation as a result of pressure. We can add to that list now Hewlett-Packard. They have divested from the occupation as well. So that campaign is also over. G4S, SodaStream, Veolia, all of them have divested from the occupation. So we have a very successful movement, which might account to some of the backlash that we're experiencing now with anti-BDS legislation and propaganda and misinformation and disinformation. I just wanted to end with a mention of my own work, because why not? I want you to know about it. We at the AFSC, we have a website called Investigate. You can find it on afsc.org/investigate, which offers you a tool to scan your investment right now for 3 different issues. It's not so clear from this, but we're working on redesigning the website. One issue is Israel-Palestine, which means corporations that are explicitly, over time, involved in human rights violations as part of the Israeli occupation. The other one is prisons, which is the prison industry in this country, in the US, including everything from supply of services to prisons, to building prisons, and so on. And the last one being immigration issues. We hope to add the companies on the US-Mexico border wall, and we have companies that manage immigrant detention in this country. The idea is that all of these issues are one and the same. They are really not, you cannot separate them. All of these issues are about international corporations that are profiting from state violence against ordinary people, and that we don't want to be invested in these companies, and we are asking others not to be invested in these companies. I think that's it. Yeah, I will end here and hope for your good questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Steve, is it okay if I just go ahead with the Q&A? I can't hear you, so I'm going to assume yes. Thank you, Dalit, and thank you, Lauren. We actually have some really, really strong questions, some that have come in from the Q&A panel and some that have come in from before we started. I'm going to start with the one that came in from Thomas, who's on the call, because it's one that comes up. How would one respond to an assertion that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic? And I think I'll send that to Dalit, but I also want to give a shout out to our new publication that QPIN just published, which is Engaging Critics of Boycott, Divestments, and Sanctions, which includes an answer to this and many, many critiques of BDS that exist. So Dalit, you want to take this one?
Yeah, thank you. There is, we didn't touch it at all. There is a huge disinformation campaign about BDS and also about anti-Zionism. And usually in order to dismantle it, you have to go back to asking, what do you mean? You know, so usually when I tell people what I actually do and tell them about the actual campaigns, then they're like, oh, this is not BDS. BDS is anti-Semitic and it's hateful. And, you know, they have this idea of what it is. And it's better to just leave the labels apart and go to what it is. And the same is true with anti-Zionism. I don't know what anti-Zionism means. I know that in Israel, Zionism has many meanings. And I think among Jewish communities also, Zionism has many meanings. So it's best to unpack it and actually ask, what do you mean? I think that it's obvious that opposing Israeli state policies is not just not anti-Semitic, but it's actually a very proud Jewish tradition. And Jews all around the world and throughout history have supported radical movements for justice and equality. And so doing that is even calling it anti-Semitic is I find it offensive as a Jew myself, I have to say. But there is anti-Semitism. There is such a thing. I was told, I'm an Israeli, so I didn't experience it myself very much. Which means that people that ask me usually if this is anti-Semitic or not, I ask them to go back and listen to their own heart. You know, people should never stop themselves from fighting for what is right, or for Palestinian liberty or any other human liberty, because they're afraid of what others might think about them. That's unskillful. You should actually ask yourself, is this thing coming from a place of love for humanity or hate for humanity? Only you can answer that question.
Thanks, Dalit. I just wanted to mention I've put up the Q&A panel, and if you have any questions, go ahead and write them here and we'll go from there. But there's a lot of really good questions that were submitted in advance. Here's one. Does your view of BDS include academic exchange with Israeli educational institutions? How can Quaker values of community and equality coexist while excluding the perspectives of all Israeli educators simply because of their affiliation? For example, how does a total BDS perspective view hand-in-hand schools? Should these schools not receive any support because they have some affiliation with the Israeli government? Where should the line be drawn for cultural and academic boycotts? So a lot of questions in one. You want to start, Dalit, and then Lauren, you want to add to that?
Sure, I'll start with the obvious basics. Go to bdsmovement.net. That's the website for the Boycott National Committee. It's a coalition of all the civil society groups that signed the original call for BDS. And you will see there are some policies about what is the extent of the call for boycott. And you can see some very useful clarifications about the academic and cultural boycotts. This is not a boycott of anything Israeli. If it was, hey, I'm an Israeli, and I've been involved in it from the start, really. So the call for boycott is of institutions that are complicit in Israeli apartheid, Israeli occupation, and human rights violations. So it's about institutions, not about individuals, and the institutions that are complicit. So the boycott of an academic institution as a boycott coming from below is not dictated by a state or by a regulation, or it's not really about, it's not punitive because it doesn't come from above. It's about your ability to not work with an institution that you don't agree with. If you have other ways of influencing their policy, you should use them as well.
Great. Lauren, do you want to add anything, or?
I guess the only thing I would add is that one of the pieces of information that I learned from CUPIN about the BDS calls is that in their original formation, it was stated that people can decide which ones speak to them. And so there isn't a sense that if you hear about some aspect of the movement that you're not comfortable with, that you're supposed to engage in all aspects of the BDS movement or answer all of the calls. And to me, that was really helpful that there is a personal discernment, as Dalit said, that is being asked of each individual about what they feel called to. And I would just then offer another plug for the document that we have referenced, which has that question and a lot of other questions that I think as someone who is not an expert like Dalit is and came to CUPIN with a lot of questions about BDS, that having had access to the answers to my questions really made me feel solidly grounded in being a supporter of the movement in a way that I hadn't been before I got to ask those questions and have those answers. And I think that commitment, as for me as an educator and as a social justice educator, to myself really knowing things deeply and then being able to support my students in learning deeply about things is important.
Great. So this next question, I think I'm going to give to you first, Lauren. It is in three parts, but I'm going to ask all of it. What approaches, methodologies do you recommend for facilitating dialogue at Friends schools? Should we focus on adults or students or both? Or in small groups, committees, classes, faculty meetings, or assemblies? So that's sort of how to deliver the information. 2, are there resource people for schools that you would recommend? Would they be most appropriate for large groups or small groups or both? For an audience of faculty, administrator, or students or both? And then the last one is for students, are there age-appropriate methodologies and resource persons for upper school, middle school, and lower school students?
Those are a lot of questions.
I know. They're interconnected, so.
Yeah. And if I forget parts of it, please.
I'll remind you, yeah.
Me. So I think for me, I would say starting with adults and working with adults to formulate the right queries seems important, and then giving students the opportunity to have discussions around the intersection of justice issues and Quaker values is the most productive way for them to feel a real ownership of those issues, that we're not telling them what to think, but we're giving them information about things and then asking them to consider those justice issues through the lens of Quaker values. So I think the conversation should happen among all constituencies of the community, but I think starting with having some adult conversations to formulate the right queries is important. I would say, to me, AFSC is a great resource in terms of getting support and engaging your community in these topics. What was the third question?
For students, are there age-appropriate methodologies?
I think having the right people in the room who are experts in that age group, who are thinking about what the right questions are to ask and how to connect that to Quaker values is the best advice I would be able to offer for that.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to switch to oh, go ahead, delete.
I just want to add something. Not being a teacher right now myself, even though I used to be a teacher. It's also, I think, a relevant question as to what to focus on when we talk in the school about these issues. And I think one thing that is happening now, and that's kind of the elephant in the room, is that there is a huge backlash movement against BDS, and it's coming from above. And it includes a lot of silencing techniques, including legislation. And it's very scary. And also it's fraught with disinformation about what the movement is. And what happens is very often is that we are drawn to talk about BDS like we are right now. We're talking about BDS. So one resource I want to recommend is a website that was put together by Palestine Legal, which is called Right to Boycott, righttoboycott.org, where you can find more information about legislation about BDS and so on, and what it is on the state and federal levels. But also I suggest talking just about Palestine, not about BDS. So instead of talking about ourselves and our ability to participate in some campaigns or take on a big corporation, and these are all things that I want people to do, the education should be about Palestine. What's going on in Palestine right now? What's going on the West Bank? What is going on in Gaza? What is going on inside the legal borders of the State of Israel? And so people will know more and care about that more. So we shouldn't be deflected by the discussion about BDS.
I would just add to that the times that I have taught in my history classes about Palestine, my students are always blown away because they have learned so little, almost nothing about it in school before I teach them in high school about it. And so I would second that just helping to build a foundation for them is something important.
Great. Well, we have, I think, time for one more question. And this one is both of you, I think, can help answer. AFSC's traditionally played a role in bringing parties with opposing views to the table for dialogue and to seek common ground. What are some strategies for encouraging courageous conversations within Quaker groups and for helping people learn listening tools for understanding around the charged and complex issue of Israel-Palestine? Delete, you want to try it first, and then we'll move to Lauren?
Yeah, I suggest BDS. I think one of the best tools of getting the conversation actually going is to making it local and making it relevant. Talk about your own investment. Talk about the business that you do with your workplace, or talk about your pension fund, or talk about your church funds, or whatever. It's something that is yours, and it is about yourself and your place in the world through this economy. And therefore, the conversation becomes much more relevant, much more explicit, and people actually engage in a real conversation, and they break free from these old shouting matches. Are you pro-Israel? Are you pro-Palestine? No, it's not about that. We're pro-people. Now let's see what is our role in the world. I found BDS campaigns to do exactly that and create a conversation that is inclusive and that is really very, very educational for everybody. I know that this is kind of ironic because BDS is being charged today as being divisive and hateful and so on, but I think much of the campaign that is anti-BDS is aimed at stifling that specific conversation, silencing the opportunity for that conversation. And we shouldn't let that happen.
Thanks. Lauren, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I will just quickly say, I know that providing as much information as possible before people start discussing, particularly BDS, is helpful because of how much misinformation there is and misunderstanding. So I certainly would not have any kind of discussion in a community without first informing the community about what the facts are. And then I would say, if I did a training through Baltimore Yearly Meeting last year on from debate to dialogue with dialogue skills and how to engage in deep listening. And I think if there are other communities that could have that kind of training, then it helps everyone to get on the same page about what dialogue skills are, rather than I think we're so often used to debating.
Great, thank you. So it's 5. Steve, do you want to close us out and say goodbye to people? And I wanted to just mention, for any of you who registered for this call, we will be sending the Engaging Critics of BDS document to you for your use. So,
thank you. I'm really thrilled by everything we've heard, and that many of you were able to attend this webinar. I want to go teach at a Quaker school now. I'm just fired up about it. Thank you, Lucy, for facilitating, Diana for managing the technology, and please keep in touch. We'll send you an email, or if you're interested in getting involved in our work, let me know.
I have one more thing to say. Thank you, and thank you especially to Lauren and Delete, and also that this has been recorded, so we will be sharing it, and we hope that those of you who are in Friends Schools will share it widely with other people in Friends Schools. Clearly, there's a huge amount of misinformation. There's a lot of propaganda, and trying to offer dialogue and information that counters that, I think, is really important. It's part of being an educator. So.
Yes, thank you, Lauren and Delete. It was fantastic.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.